So I'd like to briefly introduce first Nathan Widder. He's a professor of political theory at University of London and Royal Holloway University, and he got his PhD from University of Essex in England, and he published a lot of articles, and he presented wonderful speeches at different venues and conferences, and including his significant books of genealogies of difference and reflections on time and politics, and the most recent one is about political theory after Deleuze. So today Nathan talks about Deleuze's book on Nietzsche and philosophy and the logic of sense. Yeah, I expect some really interesting talk from Nathan. So back to you, Nathan.
Thank you, Woo-Sung. It's great to see everyone. Well, everyone I can see on screen. And good morning from London at 7 a.m. Oh, sorry, let me pull the paper up. You can still see me, right?
Yeah, no problem.
Like I'm looking at you when I'm looking at my screen, reading my paper.
Yeah.
This is, I think, going to time out at 31 minutes. So I hope a minute extra is
good.
Okay.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I will begin this paper by laying out a scenario offered by Nietzsche's account of the origins of noble and slave moralities. This may or may not be genealogical, but that's something you need to ask Jay and Kim. We can understand this account in terms of what Deleuze calls an encounter or event. The event involves a clash of forces that differ in strength and weakness, which Nietzsche distinguishes with the titles noble and slave. The clash creates a problem, one that is fully real and objective and not simply something contrived in the heads of the antagonists, of finding a moral interpretation or judgment that can make sense of the event. As a problem, however, it presents nothing more than a vague and indistinct plurality, because there is not a matter of fitting the event under some pre-existing category in order to decide what it is, there being no set of distinct but opposed categories yet in existence. Under such conditions, the encounter can mean, and indeed does mean, anything and everything and nothing at all. We always begin thinking, Deleuze says, when we encounter something for which our concepts and categories are inadequate, something that we cannot recognize but can only sense. Realizing a set of categories to grasp the event and solve the problem posed by the encounter is a task of thinking. Nietzsche offers two solutions with the moralities of good and bad and good and evil, but he never says that these are the only two possibilities. So we have an encounter, a problem of making sense of it by cutting meaningful distinctions out of a vague plurality of senses, and various ways of cutting and thus solving the problem. However, for the divisions given by any solution to have the determinate actuality required for judging the encounter, or for judging anything else once these divisions are formed that falls within its remit, they must be anchored in such a way that a subject can meaningfully receive and employ them. No answer can escape the possibility of simply being meaningless to some concrete subject or other. So for Nietzsche, the anchoring that allows these divisions to be meaningful is found in the wills to power of the nobles and slaves, each of whom, we could follow Deleuze in saying, incarnates one of these moralities, literally making it flesh and blood. Yet it is not as real individuals that nobles and slaves incarnate their respective moralities, but rather as perspectives of appraisal expressed by their respective wills to power. It is from the height of the pathos of distance that the nobles first seize the right to create values of good and bad. It is from the lowly perspective of the slaves, who are like sheep looking up at great birds of prey that carry off and consume them, that the morality of good and evil is born. Nobles and slaves each have the morality they ought to have given their respective dominant and dominated positions. These positions result from their clash and inframe the way each necessarily appraises their moral worlds. Now, the point I want to make in setting this all out is that the process by which the good, bad, and good, evil distinctions are consolidated and defined, the process by which noble and slave perspectives incarnating them are formed, are irreducibly different. One is a differentiation of an inexact yet rigorous multiplicity of indistinct and vanishingly small differences that constitutes the virtual problem. where this differentiation moves these differences from a state where the law of contradiction does not apply to a state in which it does. The other is the essential process of an intensity that seems to disappear in the process of unfolding and expressing itself. These distinct processes, of course, are what Deleuze refers to as the actualization of the virtual and intensity's process of individuation. Now, in what follows, I will examine this distinction, which Deleuze inaugurates in Difference and Repetition, between the virtual and its process of actualization and intensity in its process of individuation or incarnation, by tracing it back to the discussion of force and power in Nietzsche and philosophy. I will then explore how this distinction is further developed in terms of distinct processes of actualization versus effectuation in the logic of sense. Now, interpreters of the last text, at least in the Anglosphere, typically seem to suffer from the translation's rendering of the French effectuation as actualization, which gives the false impression that sense for Deleuze involves the actualization of a virtual field in bodies and states of affairs. This, in turn, reinforces a continuing doxa within Deleuze scholarship that takes Bergson to be Deleuze's chief inspiration. Now, against this, and continuing a seemingly endless personal crusade of mine to get people to stop seeing Bergson as quite so central to Deleuze, I maintain that the logic of sense consolidates a break with Bergson that is found in Deleuze's distinguishing of the virtual and the intensive. Having treated actualization, incarnation, or embodiment as rendered in the English translation, and effectuation, all as interchangeable and resulting from a single process in his 1966 Bergsonism, Deleuze within a few years draws careful distinctions between these terms and does so in a way that circumscribes the role played by the virtual actual in his eventual rethinking of identity, difference, time, sense, and becoming. Ultimately, as I hope to make clear, the virtual's actualization grounds the categories of representation, while intensity and individuation, on the one hand, act as the means to accomplish this grounding, and on the other hand, drive an ungrounding, or a line of flight away from, representation, thought, and change. This development, as I say, can be traced to the distinction Deleuze draws in Nietzsche and philosophy between force and the will to power, where he holds these two concepts to be inseparable, but not for that reason identical, declaring that force is what can, will to power is what wills. From there, it continues, as I say, in Difference and Repetition and in the logic of sense. Now, Deleuze contends in Nietzsche and philosophy that the pluralist concept of force follows necessarily once the substantive concepts of thing and object are shown to be incapable of accounting for the plurality, distance, and relation required of them. A force unable to affect others would not be a force at all. It would be impotent. And so every force is, quote, essentially related to another force, unquote. This relation entails a quantitative difference. As Deleuze writes, difference in quantity is the essence of force and of the relation of force to force, but it is a quantitative difference that cannot be equalized, as any measurement via an external scale leaves the determination of forces, quote, abstract, incomplete, and ambiguous. Forces also have a quality related to their difference in quantity, which arises because this quantitative difference cannot be equalized, so that while each force is what it is by virtue of its relations to other forces, the irreducibility of these relations also makes each force qualitatively distinct. So quantitatively, differing forces are strong or weak, or stronger and weaker, while qualitatively they are active or reactive. If I may be permitted to use some dialectical language at a Deleuze conference, we can say that force's quantitative difference expresses what it is in its being for others, while its quality expresses its being for itself. Nevertheless, Deleuze maintains, forces defined only by their relations, quote, would remain indeterminate unless an element which is capable of determining them from a double point of view is added to force itself, unquote. This element is the will to power, which determines forces in terms of both the reciprocal genesis of their difference in quantity and the absolute genesis of their distinct qualities. The will to power is the in itself of forces that are what they are for others and themselves only through their relations. Now, invoking this in itself with its implication of being pure and non-relational might appear to undermine entirely the metaphysics of force, but Nietzsche holds that mechanism's own victorious concept of force demands it. A force's power is also its capacity to be affected, but mechanism lacks any account of this affectivity. As Nietzsche states, the will to power must therefore be introduced because, quote, mere variations of power could not feel themselves to be such. There must be present something that wants to grow and interprets the value of whatever else wants to grow, end quote. Importantly, with respect to this presence of this will of the will to power, these different powers are, quote, equal in that, unquote. A univocity thus obtains amongst forces in their internal drive to discharge themselves. The will to power thereby expresses an intensity of force that is distinct from the relationality that defines force's essence. No force could be or become without an inner compulsion to discharge itself against resistances. This compulsion provides the final determination of forces, but in a very precise way. By virtue of the will to power, clashing forces are determined not in their strength and weakness, nor in their activity and reactivity, but instead in their singularity. The will to power individuates forces, not by making them one of a kind or unique, but by establishing the multiple senses of their struggle and thus the multiple senses of their becoming. In this way, the individual is always a multiple singularity. Now, this same language of double determination is found in difference and repetition, when Deleuze presents intensity as an irreducible supplement needed to account for the actualization of virtual ideas. Chapter 3 of the text challenges the dogmatic image that conceives thought on a model of recognition, where thinking means recognizing an object by submitting it to the categories of representation. Against this, Deleuze asserts that we only begin thinking when forced into it through an encounter with intensity, which resides within the sensible as something unrecognizable, unrepresentable, and unknowable, any categories that might delineate this intensity still needing to be created. This creation comes about by the way the encounter engenders ideas, which are not really my ideas because they relate to a spontaneity of thought that occurs within me, but which I do not author. Kant holds ideas to be pure concepts of reason that determine how the understanding is employed to deal with experience in its totality. Kant maintains that since they provide systematicity to thinking, but cannot be given as an object of possible experience, these ideas remain a problem without any solution. Kant nevertheless also presents an idea whose mere thought engenders its solution when he discusses the comprehensive structure given by the idea of philosophy in the first critique's penultimate chapter, the Archetectonic of Pure Reason, which is perhaps where the real connections between Kantian and Deleuzian ideas is to be found. Deleuze adopts and adapts this Kantian understanding, arguing that ideas are problematic structures that are capable of solution, but do not disappear when resolved. He further holds against Kant that ideas are not simply regulative of how we understand reality, but constitutive, accounting for a triple genesis of the qualities that allow objects to be distinguished, the time and space that serve as conditions of knowledge, and the concepts that bring knowledge into being. Ideas, however, do not generate the reality of objects as such, but rather those aspects that allow them to make sense. Deleuzian ideas thereby eschew the epistemological question, what is X, and instead concern questions such as who, how much, in what cases, etc. Now, for Deleuze, ideas are differential structures whose elements are indeterminate in themselves, but become determinable in reciprocal relations to one another, and for which complete determination is possible. Thus, in the calculus, dx and dy are indeterminate in themselves, since as infinitesimals they are nothing but indefinitely small magnitudes, but they are reciprocally determinable in the relational form of dy over dx, and completely determined when specific values are yielded for the differential. Ideas have a tripartite principle of sufficient reason that relates to and expresses pure elements of quantitability. Deleuze refers to the x plus dx, qualitability, that's the dy over dx, and potentiality or power, which he associates with their complete determination. Ideas are virtual insofar as they are determined by way of vanishingly small differences. There are no discernibly separate and opposed components of the virtual idea. Instead, its differences are distinct but obscure, and hence the law of contradiction. This is this and not that does not apply. Separations instead arise with the idea's actualization, which solves its problematic structure by differentiating its vanishing differences into qualitatively distinct species and quantifiable extensive parts. The idea's qualitability and quantitability are thereby unfolded. Now, you might think that sorting out the categories and divisions under which things and events are classified would provide a pretty complete sense of what these things and events are. But Deleuze insists that the idea actualized into species and parts remains vague and incomplete, expressing only abstract generalities of quantity and quality. There must be a further determination from a double point of view by an additional element that dramatizes the idea. Deleuze says by way of spatio-temporal dynamisms lying beneath actualized species and parts. Now, pace Kant, the dynamic involves the synthesis of heterogeneities and refers not to an object's appearance, but to its relations to other objects and the modalities of its existence. For Deleuze, these relations and modalities are not merely regulative, but constitutive. So the dynamic is constitutive for Deleuze, it's merely regulative for Kant. And they realize the idea, the dynamisms realize the idea in a completely different way than its actualization in species and parts. Now, returning to the moral problem presented by Nietzsche, we can say that while notions such as intentional harm, selfishness, and sacrifice, maybe also shame, can provide a general account of, say, the difference between good and evil, these remain meaningless cliches unless we can tie them to figures who enact them, unless we can refer to heroes and villains, to characters whose manner of being in relations to others illustrate concretely what it is to be a selfish or self-sacrificing person, etc., and thus sketch out the answers to the question of who, which one, how, and so forth. This is precisely how Nietzsche's nobles and slaves dramatize their moralities. Dramatization, Deleuze says, differentiates the differentiation of differences. It's here that intensity appears. Actualization remains indeterminate without dramatization. Dramatization finds its ground in individuation, the essential process of intensity. Deleuze holds intensity to be the in itself of difference, expressing how difference is first implicated in itself, incorporating the unequal into itself independently of its relations to others, and thus before it is implicated and explicated in such relations. Intensity is inseparable from the idea's virtual structure, but it resides within it as something different. Intensity, we can say, is included in the idea, but is not accounted for by the idea. It is the ideas, and therefore thoughts, immanent outside. Deleuze also calls intensity the reason of the sensible, that by which the given is given. In this respect, Deleuze's intensity parallels Kant's claim that every object of experience a priori displays an intensive degree of reality. But for Deleuze, such a degree is not a unit on a fixed scale, but an intensive quantitative difference. And thus, though we can speak of differences of intensity, this statement is tautological, because intensity is difference. What is given may in some sense be more or less intense, but all givens are equal in expressing intensity, just as for Nietzsche, all forces are equal in expressing wills to power. So what then is intensity's essential process of individuation? Deleuze states that the individuating is not the simple individual, and that it cannot be seen as an extension or completion of actualization. That is, as a determination that narrows the species down to the individual. Instead, and in line with the idea of the dynamic as a synthesis of heterogeneities, he offers individuation as a synthesis of the disparate, that is, what cannot be compared, having no commonality, and being different in kind. A synthesis of the disparate by way of a difference in itself that differs in the first instance from itself, and therefore has no identity. Intensive difference serves as the connector without establishing an identity between what it connects. Now, crucial here is difference and repetition's discussion of Leibnizian incompossibility, which Deleuze distinguishes from Weiss diction, holding that while incompossibility is an analytic extension of Weiss diction that for Leibniz reconciles the world's discreteness and continuity, incompossibility implies, quote, implies only divergence, unquote. On these terms, we can say that the virtual idea forms a structure of Weiss-dicting differences, while individuation involved the synthesis of incompossibles. For Leibniz, there is no essential difference between Adam the sinner and Adam not the non-sinner, but instead an incompossibility of their worlds. It is logically possible for Adam not to sin, but the non-sinning Adam implies a world wholly incompatible with our own. This makes Adam a figure without fixed identity who crosses between and connects these two worlds. But he is also a difference that is at once the smallest and the most absolute. The atoms of these two worlds are essentially indiscernible and yet completely different. The smallest difference between them is at the same time the greatest chasm. Deleuze adds to this picture by insisting against Leibniz that incompossibles belong to the same world. Instead of one world where Adam sins and another where he does not, there is a single world where it is undecidable whether Adam sins or doesn't sin, and where he both sins and doesn't sin, because it depends on one's point of view. In this perspectival world, which for Deleuze is our world, Adam is not a definite individual who might be determined as a sinner or non-sinner, but an intensity linking these disparate realities within this one world. The figure of Adam anchors the actualization of these various realities by way of a multiple dramatization. He is therefore at one and the same time the first sinner, the first fall guy, a hero, a tragic figure, so on. Moreover, while there are many perspectives on Adam, Adam also incarnates or embodies a perspective on the world, expressing clearly a region of disparate relations, and also expressing confusedly the totality of them. Intensity constitutes individuality in the sense that no two perspectives envelop the same region. By dramatizing the idea so as to constitute an irreducible plurality of perspectives, individuation further ensures that the idea is always actualized in multiple ways. Intensity ramifies the series it brings into communication. This is how it repeats. The many actual solutions it creates are then engaged in a struggle for dominance, again in line with Nietzsche's account of the will to power as a drive to interpret and impose interpretations on the world. We're up to the logic of sense part, in about 6 or 7 minutes to do it too. All right. In relation to difference and repetition, the most obvious development of the logic of sense is the shift to the surface. Deleuze himself states in the preface to the Italian translation of the text that concepts remain the same as the earlier work, but they are reorganized according to this surface dimension. But this portrayal masks the way the logic of sense, though centrally concerned with surface intensity, essentially ignores the virtual and its actualization. As noted already, the English translation's rendering of effectuation as actualization and contra-effectuation as counter-actualization encourages many confusions on this point. Effectuation concerns the donation of sense as it applies to designated states of affairs, signifying concepts and expressive, i.e. speaking, subjects. Sense emerges when incorporeal events that are the effects of the interactions of corporeal bodies free themselves from these bodies to express pure becomings that are indifferent, to the corporeal actions and passions from which they emerge. A scalpel penetrates a body, but this reality's meaningfulness comes not from the physical interaction of the metal and flesh, but insofar as this singular happening relating to other singular happenings gives rise to an impersonal, pre-individual, an ideational event of cutting, in proximity to which the scalpel and body are placed. It's in proximity to a pure event of greening that a tree can be said to be more or less green, or to become more or less green. In proximity to an event of sinning that Adam is judged to sin or not sin. In proximity to an event of thinking that one can declare, I think. In each case, a bivalence prevails in the sense of these events. They express a becoming in two directions at once. The growth to adulthood is simultaneously the decay and dissolution of childhood, and so this growth dissolution only takes on a unidirectional character when some end or telos is imposed upon it. Hence, Deleuze holds that this becoming is best expressed by the infinite form of verbs, i.e. to cut, which is indifferent to the subject or object of cutting, as well as the positive or negative judgments of cutting happening. Now, the bivalence and purity of its events makes sense neutral in relation to bodies and their states of affairs. Sense is neither active nor passive, but impassive, not of the nature to act or be acted upon. But Deleuze also insists on sense's power to produce something in states of affairs. While only corporeal interactions can produce incorporeal sense, only sense can individuate bodies and their mixtures. Effectuation individuates and incarnates sense in the bodies that engender it. It is thus not an actualization. It follows from the way events only become independent from bodies or states of affairs through their relations to one another. Being singular, events have no necessary or internal connection with one another. Their relations are quasi-causal rather than causal, meaning they're external relations whose organization comes from the outside. For Deleuze, this organization involves events communicating through a paradoxical or nonsense capital E event that does not simply become in two directions at once, but immediately differs from itself. The capital E event is an intensity that engenders the thinking necessary to organize the surface of events. I'm about 5 minutes away, I think, from finishing, maybe a little less. Now, the principles of surface organization are Leibnizian. From the communication of ideational verb events, the organized surface affects static ontological and logical geneses. The first constitutes individuals and persons from this impersonal and pre-individual field. Individuals engender worlds defined by vice, diction, and convergence, the individual being a monad enveloping and expressing the totality of a world, but expressing clearly and distinctly only a local region of it. Persons, on the other hand, connect incompossible worlds. A person is, quote, objectively indeterminate, a vagabond or nomad who, quote, holds good for many of these worlds, or in the last analysis for all worlds, despite their divergences in the individuals which inhabit them, unquote. Individuals and persons bear absolutely singular predicates. A tree is this color and this green. And here, there is nothing more general about having color than being green. Disparate atoms reside in a multiplicity of gardens, but each is always this singular garden. Singular predicates nevertheless provide the logical possibilities for propositions that, using individuals and persons as material instances, resolve the problematic structure of events, bringing them to bear upon objects and states of affairs in the second genesis. Deleuze here offers the example of the battle as an impassive capital E event hovering over a state of affairs and being effectuated in its associated bodies. The battle and its pure events of killing, dying, wounding, and fleeing are unlocalizable, but are incarnated in the different disparate realities of the soldier who fires his weapon, the one who flees from danger, the one who lies mortally wounded, and so on. These lived realities share only the problematic of battle, whose effectuated sense structure gives them meaning. But this same structure also engenders counter-effectuations that release the event from the individuated senses its effectuation entails, returning it to the impassiveness where it communicates with all other vice-dicting and incompossible events and realities. Counter-effectuation affirms difference and divergence, and for Deleuze, this is an ethical affirmation. He cites Joe Bousquet, a soldier paralyzed in the Great War, whose injury became a starting point for a body of poetic work which, quote, is in its entirety a meditation on the wound, the event, and language, unquote. The meditation concerns the possibility of amour fati, a love of fate without ressentiment. This is in no way a matter of transforming catastrophic injury into something cheerful, nor is it a matter of being resigned in the face of it, but about releasing the self from ressentiment and ill will that comes from a moral condemnation of the world that allows such events to happen to us. It presents, Deleuze writes, a volitional intuition and transmutation. So how, and this is the end of the paper, how does actualization relate to all this? The few points where the term appears in the logic of sense make clear it appears in about 4 places. Actualization rather than effectuation. Impersonal and pre-individual singularities, Deleuze writes, preside over the genesis of individuals and persons. These singularities are, quote, distributed in a potential which admits neither self nor I. This, end quote, this potential, quote, produces them by actualizing or effectuating itself. However, quote, the figures of this actualization, that is to say, the self and the I, do not resemble the effectuated potential, that is, individuals and persons. Individuals and persons are not selves or Is. As both difference and repetition in the logic of sense discuss, I and self are components of a structure of the other, l'autrui, that papers over centers of individuation by explicating intensities. This structure other, as Deleuze explains in the 4th appendix of the Logic of Sense, gives rise to, quote, an entire field of virtualities and potentialities which I already knew were capable of being actualized, unquote, and renders possible the constitution of a series of categories on which the perceptual field functions. In short, actualization of the virtual grounds the world of representation. Effectuation is wrapped up with this process of actualization precisely because actualization needs to be accomplished. That is to say, it needs to be effectuated. But it also, by way of counter-effectuation, is the way representation is ungrounded or dissolved. I therefore close this paper by suggesting that perhaps we would do well to forget about the virtual, or at least assign it far less importance, because what matters in all of this is intensity. Although the virtual and its actualization certainly have a place in Deleuze's thought, his ultimate aim is to get us beyond them. Thank you.